um, and kick off the first webinar in our summer training series, and it's Introduction to Legislative Advocacy. Whitney, advance the first slide. So, hopefully, most of you know us, but we're the Western Center on Law and Poverty. We fight in the courts, cities, counties, and the capital to secure housing, healthcare, and public benefits. We've been doing this for over 55 years, and we advocate through the lens of economic and racial justice for a strong safety net for low-income Californians. The presenters today are myself, Rebecca Gonzales. I'm a policy advocate with the Western Center on our public benefits and access to justice team. And Whitney Francis is our other speaker, and I'll let her introduce herself when it's her turn to speak. So by the end of this training, you will know Legal Services Corporation restrictions, understand the California legislative and budget process, understand the basics of policy research and analysis, and know persuasive advocacy strategies. And so just to get us kicked off, I'm just going to do a little bit about lobbying activities for LSC organizations. For those of you who are a legal services corporation organizations, you're allowed to give input in the legislative and budget process when you are expressly invited to do so. That's usually through a letter, which I'll show on the next slide, but you can testify orally or in writing, provide information, which can include analysis or comments upon existing or draft proposed rules, regulations, or legislation, and participate in negotiated rulemaking. But you do have to have that invitation. And you cannot solicit or arrange for that request to be made. And you may make communications in response to a request only to the party or parties that made the request, and to other persons or entities to the extent necessary. And lastly, when you're asked to participate in a notice or comment, you have to use non-LSC funded sources, but you should also consult your supervisor and your organization for their policy on this. Next slide. And so this is what an invitation looks like. It comes from a legislator on their letterhead, and it's an invitation to provide information on this cases on a bill. And it basically says you can share comments with any office committees or other Assembly and Senate offices. So hopefully it's a broad invitation, but this is what you will need to comment on. So the Western Center will arrange for these kind of letters to come out when we're working on a bill that we're sponsoring, and then we'll solicit input through our various listservs, such as California Welfare Advocates, so people can send letters in on support or provide any other information. Next slide. And so just as a preface to the introduction to the bill process, how a bill becomes a law, most of you probably know this, but we have a bicameral legislature, 40 Senate members, 80 Assembly members. The Democrats have a supermajority of members, so that makes it a little easier to get things passed. Most bills are only a majority vote, but some are a 2/3 vote. We do have 2-year sessions. We're at the end of a 2-year session right now, and about 4,000 bills are introduced over those 2 years. So there's quite a few bills that we look at. And there is a 12-year term limit across the legislature. This didn't used to be didn't always used to be the case. There was a proposition in the early 90s, I believe, but it's a 12-year term limit over the two houses, so they could split it up however. So you could have, one 4-year term on the Senate, and the rest of the 12 years could be in the Assembly. So with that, I'll kick it off to Whitney.
Thanks, Becca. I'm Whitney Francis. I'm also a policy advocate at the Western Center on our health team and also our public benefits taxes to justice team. And I will be walking us through how a bill becomes a law. So to start, the first important thing I want to take note of is the legislative calendar. this really rules the legislative advocacy process and helps to shape key points of time when we can strategically sort of plan our advocacy around. So, in February of each year is the bill introduction deadline for new bills to be introduced. And then March through May, we move into committee hearings. Um, and then by like mid or end of May is the House of Origin deadline for a bill to pass and move on to the next house. Um, and then June, July, that process of committee hearings repeats in the second house. And then by August or September, we're reaching the end of session and bills need to be passed, and moved on to the governor, um, and or else they don't make it. Um, and then and then on the left is an overview of the steps that it takes for a bill to become a law. So a legislator introduces a bill that then moves through the first house. So if they're a senator, the bill it will get a title SB and a number. And then if they're an assembly member who introduces the bill will have a label AB and a number. And then the bill then moves through policy and fiscal committees, and then finally to the floor for a vote by the entire chamber. If it passes through all of that and moves to the second house, then the process repeats again. And then finally, if it um, passes out of the second house, then it gets to the governor's desk where he must make a decision on whether or not the bill becomes law. And I'll walk through that in greater detail next. And then I also wanted to know, concurrently to the legislative process and timeline, the governor and the legislature are working on the state budget simultaneously. And so those deadlines are also just as important to keep track of, and to try to strategically plan around since it can interact with the legislative process. And sometimes we also see policy move through the budget process more and more these days. Um, so before I jump into things, I wanted to highlight a couple of resources that can help you keep track of the legislative and budget process. The Assembly and the Senate both have their own websites where you can find more information on the legislators, when committee hearings are being scheduled, other committee information, etc. And each chamber produces what they call a daily file that contains all of that information as well. And then also helpful is Leginfo, where you can go to look at information on bills that have been introduced, review the bill text, track amendments, view committee analyses, and then look at the bill history for past and current years. You can also on Leginfo access the state constitution and our state codes, which can sometimes be helpful. And Leginfo has a bill tracking feature that you can sign up for if you register and make an account. And it'll send you like alerts and updates. So now to start with the details of the legislative process, the first step is that it starts with a bill idea. Bill ideas can come from many different places. Sometimes for example, when we work with our legal aid, regional legal aid centers, sometimes there are different patterns that come up with clients that we see and that maybe need more of a systemic fix. So that's one place that we might get a bill idea. Sometimes they come directly from community members who are dealing with some sort of issue, or from lived experience experts. Maybe there's a court decision and we want to run a bill in response to a court decision, um, to try to mitigate the harms or to codify something, maybe a federal law or statute. Um, or someone's just like, we should have a law about this. Um, there's also a lot of strategic reasons to run a bill. Like I said before, maybe there's a long-standing need for a systemic fix. Like, I feel like we often see this in our public benefits systems, or perhaps there's a window of opportunity where we are building off the success and momentum of, say, a pilot project and want to take it statewide, or there's heightened attention to an issue because of like a Surgeon General report or some sort of news coverage, media coverage on the issue. Bills are also a great way to just educate the legislature and build awareness for any given issue or to increase visibility. Um, and also, some groups may use bills as leverage in other processes. For example, unions may have like negotiations, contract negotiations on the side, but they run a bill and they kind of use that as leverage for their negotiations. So a lot of different reasons why you would run a bill. Um, and then next, how do you move your bill from an idea to an actual piece of legislation? First, it starts with really good research. In your research, these are some questions that you might want to consider and prepare for, since these are the kinds of questions that you'll end up having to answer throughout the entire process as you pitch your idea to members, and then also as it moves through the legislative process to committees and whatnot. So starting off, you really want to identify the problem or the issue at hand, who's harmed or impacted, whether directly or indirectly, and at what scale. What is your proposed solution? How does this bill aim to solve those issues? Um, why is this needed in state statute? And you might get asked, like, why not go through work with the state departments and work through the regulations to do this. And why now? Um, what are the relevant state agencies that would have to implement your bill or are affected by your bill? We commonly get asked, like, have you talked to the department? So you might want to schedule those meetings with folks in the departments to try to get their input on your idea. Also, cost is a major factor. How much would the proposal cost the state, especially during times like now where we're in a really tight budget year and there's a lot of uncertainty with all of the federal things going on. Um, Sometimes you can get estimates from a lot of different places, like the Legislative Analyst Office is a good resource, directly from the state agencies or from trusted research institutions. Sometimes maybe the Department of Finance might have numbers from previous years. And then also, if you have an idea of a potential funding source, I think the assumption is that the cost will come out of the state general fund, but if maybe there's like a special tax on, like, for example, tobacco or cannabis that you can like pull from, and that's not the general fund, that's always ideal and helps. Has there been similar legislation that has been attempted in previous years, whether successfully or not, or in the current year? And then is there federal legislation or federal regs on this? Or maybe have other states tried to pass or have passed similar legislation that we can look to? And then finally, just trying to identify potential supporters and opponents for your bill or your issue and anticipating arguments for or against and thinking about who you might want to work with in coalition to get your bill through the process and over the finish line. So the next step is finding an author. Depending on your issue, you might, if it's more maybe like local or regionally focused, or if it's an issue that maybe has come from like a specific community, you might want to look for a member who represents that district. Um, So, for example, we ran a bill on banning leaded aviation gas that was kind of a product of the organizing work in the San Fernando Valley. So we ended up getting Senator Menjivar, who represents the area, to be our author. Um, you could try to check their voting record on certain issues, or also the Cal Matters digital democracy tool is really helpful to look at like their voting records or to see what committees they might sit on. Another way to find an author is to just try to find members who are interested in your issue. So a good place to start is looking at the committee that your bill might go through and look at who are the chair or the members of those committees, or whether they have a demonstrated track record working on your issue, such as like their background before becoming a legislator, could also be a good place to look. The next step is to introduce your bill. So, to get it ready for bill introduction, you need to have your language drafted by legislative council, or leg council for short. They're a nonpartisan agency that supports the legislature to draft bill proposals and draft bill language, among other things. Depending on who your bill author is, or whether they're in the Assembly or Senate, your bill will get introduced as an Assembly bill or Senate bill. Um, and then after a bill is introduced, it must be in print for 30 days before any action is allowed to be taken, whether that's referring it to policy committee, or for you to make amendments to the language. So just something to keep in mind. Um, and then next is committee. Bills are assigned by the Rules Committee to specific policy committees based on their subject matter, or what the state code, or like what state codes they're amending or adding to. So, for example, a lot of our housing bills get referred to the Judiciary Committee rather than the Housing Committee because they deal with like a lot of property rights, civil litigation issues like fines and fees or evictions, etc. When your bill is referred to a committee prior to the actual hearing, you'll be working with the committee consultants who prepare detailed analyses for each bill that passes through the committee. So you'll be meeting with them. Sometimes, or I guess pretty often, a bill will be amended as it goes through the committee, whether those are amendments suggested by the committee, which are called committee amendments, or whether those amendments are a product of negotiations or discussions with stakeholders, such as potential opposition. You'll also want to meet with members of the committee, particularly their staff who staff that certain issue area, to make sure your bill has the votes to make it out and to see if they have any questions or concerns about your bill before it gets presented in the hearing. You'll also want to prepare letters of support, work with supporters to make sure they know when the hearing is and are ready to show up to support it. You want to work with and meet with opposition to try to address their concerns, and prepare for any questions that may come up in the hearing. So at the hearing, the author will present their bill, and then they will pass things off to their support witnesses to testify. Typically, there's two primary witnesses who each have 2 minutes to share their testimony. We often like to have a technical expert to answer questions about the bill, and then also someone like a lived experience expert to speak more personally to why this issue is important. And then anyone else in support or opposition to the bill can share their position afterwards. which we refer to as a Me Too, and that's just your name, affiliation, and your position on the bill. And then afterwards, the opposition has the same 2 minutes, witnesses, um, two primary witnesses to testify against the bill. Um, and to get out of committee, you just need a simple majority in most cases. So the next step is the fiscal committee, which is referred to as appropriations, and any bill with a cost goes to appropriations. If the cost is under the threshold, in the Assembly, it's $150,000, or in the Senate, it's $50,000. Uh, if it's under the threshold, then it gets passed out of appropriations on the first hearing. But if it's over those thresholds, it will be assigned to what's called the suspense file. You never really know whether your bill's going to get off of the suspense file and out of the committee until suspense day, where all the suspense file bills are heard all at once. And it's a fairly opaque process for how it's decided what bills are going to make it out and what bills are held. But typically, each legislator ranks their package of bills by priority, um, and kind of negotiate with the committee chair. And then also the legislative leadership may also weigh in to prioritize certain bills that they definitely want to get out of committee, or other bills that they want to make sure don't get out of committee. And if your bill is held and doesn't make it out of suspense, then that's effectively the end of the road for your bill, and it can no longer move forward. So it's dead. So next up is the floor, if you're lucky enough to survive appropriations. And this is where your bill will be voted on by the entire chamber. Procedurally, all bills go through what's called a second reading, and it's like a courtesy notice to everyone that the bill is here. And then the third reading is when the author will actually present on the bill, and it gets voted on by everyone. Most bills need a majority vote, and so a majority vote to pass. And so in the Assembly, that's 41 votes. In the Senate, it's 21 votes. And then for urgency bills and tax levies, those require a 2/3 vote. An urgency bill means that the bill would go into effect immediately after it's passed by the governor. Um, and then, unless specified, all bills go into effect January 1st of the following calendar year. Um, when your bill's on the floor, you really want to, some key advocacy strategies are putting out floor alerts, which is kind of like a condensed fact sheet on the bill and like what position you want legislators to take, and then also coordinate lobby visits, because this is the first time that many legislators are seeing your bill. So it's important to get the word out. And just how they should support, or what position they should take, and why. So if your bill passes off of the floor in the first house and it makes it through all of that, then it moves to what we call the second house and repeats that same process all over again, going through committee and appropriations. If there's any amendments in the second house, and it passes off of the floor, then it has to go back to the first house for what's called a concurrence vote, um, just for them to kind of sign off on those new amendments, and then it finally heads to the governor's desk. And before I get into the governor, just want to make a quick note about 2-year bills. Sometimes bills can be held and moved in the second year, since we have a 2-year legislative cycle in California. So if the bill remains in the first house, then it has to make it to the second house by the end of January of that second year in the legislative cycle. And then after that, it's subject to the normal deadlines again. Um, and usually these are 2-year bills are like complicated bills or maybe a little more controversial and need some more time to work out some amendments and negotiations. So if your bill has passed through both chambers, then it heads to the governor's desk, which is really exciting and yay, congrats. But the work isn't over yet. The governor has 30 days to take action on a bill if it passed in the middle of the legislative session. Um, or he has 12 days to take action if a bill is passed at the end of session, which is a majority of the bills. There's two ways for a bill to become law. One is that the governor can sign it, or he can do nothing and just let the 30 days or the 12 days pass and it becomes law. But typically, he signs a majority of the bills. The governor can also veto the bill, meaning it does not become law. But the legislature can override it, hit a veto with a two-thirds vote. But this is really very rare and just never happens anymore. The last override was in 1979, I believe. And like I mentioned previously, most laws go into effect January 1st of the following calendar year, um, unless otherwise stated in the bill. And then urgency bills take effect immediately upon being passed. And now I'll pass it off to Becca to discuss the state budget process.
And Becca, before you go, can I actually launch this attendance poll real quick for folks to take?
Sure. Go ahead.
All right, so if folks can just fill out, there's 5 questions. If you can fill this out for us, this will help us to track everything we need to track. Thank you. I'll leave it up for about a minute. I'll leave it up for about 30 more seconds. We have 70% participation. Thank you so much. All right, thank you. Back to you, Becca.
Thank you so much. And I also want to thank my coworker Whitney for her very detailed presentation on the legislative process. I do want to point out that the Western Center can really could be a resource for you when trying to do things like pass a bill or have an idea, because the steps she explained on how to go from an idea to an actual bill are things that we do at the Western Center. We strategize about authors, all of those things. So there are resources here. And also, a lot of times you'll be working on a bill with a coalition where people can kind of spread those duties out amongst themselves. And then also, a lot of times you might see advocacy alerts from different organizations that will alert you, like send a letter to this committee at this time. So hopefully we could work together on the future that on issues we both care about. So I'm going to do the state budget process. Next slide. The state budget is really an expression of our priorities and values. And at the Western Center, we know poverty is a policy choice. And unfortunately, too often when the state budget is being debated and we're in a deficit year, they look at cuts to health and human services programs. So they're basically, balancing the budget on the back of the poor. That's something that we fight against. And at the Western Center, as many of your organizations, we believe everybody should thrive and that we should have a society where we don't have the poor. So that involves having a strong safety net, keeping people housed, ending the racialized impacts of our criminal legal system. So we look at the budget from a lot of different angles and fight on different fronts. Next slide. So budget basics. The legislature passes a new state budget every year, and it's debated apart from the legislative process, and it has its own timeline. So it's important to know those dates. But advocates who want to make changes to existing programs that probably have a fiscal implication or create new programs probably need to advocate for funding during the budget deliberations. Next slide. Things to know about the process. So it's really not as transparent as the legislative process. It's much more opaque. A lot of negotiations happen behind closed doors. I think most people are, taken aback by the budget process because it is so different. And a lot of times negotiations are happening right now. And I think Whitney mentioned there are a lot of things happening right now we don't know about. We don't know the final decision. But advocates can absolutely influence the process by knowing when and how to advocate. Next slide. So what is the budget bill and what are trailer bills? So right now, when the legislature introduces the budget, there are two bills that are introduced, an AB bill and an SB bill that'll eventually become one bill when we get an agreement between both houses of the legislature. But if you look at this bill, it's really hard to understand. I mean, it just has a lot of line items and money appropriated for that program, not a lot of narrative there, and it's not something that's easy to look at. Luckily, when the governor introduces the budget, he puts out a governor's budget summary that summarizes the changes that are proposed in January, although it does have a gubernatorial spin on it. Going back to the slide I was on, Whitney. So um, so the budget bill, like I said, it's hard to understand. Along with the budget bill, there are trailer bills that implement policies that are in the budget bill. And so trailer bills are really regular bills. They are divided by specific areas, like a human services trailer bill, a health trailer bill. And that is what has the narrative of the changes in the budget bill, how this program is going to be implemented or how this money is going to be allocated to different portions of the program. Language that is developed during the legislative process can be dumped into a trailer bill at the last minute because they've already, in a policy bill, you kind of go through the legislative process and you make refinements to how a program will be run. And that could be used for trailer bill language, but trailer bill language a lot of times is developed late in the process, in the budget process. And so language is developed. There's a budget committee, there's budget consultants who are working on this language. The governor's Department of Finance does release some trailer bill language at the beginning of the legislative process, but it is continually refined. Trailer bill language can be passed after the budget is passed, and that often happens. It's not unusual for there to be trailer bill language that is passed in August when we pass the budget by July 1st. Trailer bills and the budget require a majority vote of each house. But unfortunately, tax increases require a two-thirds vote of each house. And this year, like many years, but even more so this year because of the harmful impacts from HR 1 and the federal budget cuts coming down, we are really looking at revenue solutions, but we need to get that two-thirds vote. And so that is currently very much in play in this year's budget. Next slide.
So, Becca, you had a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to wait until the end to answer questions or if you wanted to address
I
it
don't
now.
I don't mind. Could you read it to me though, Rashida?
Yes. How does an organization who can lobby draft a trailer bill and have it officially accepted to debate it or negotiate it?
So, yeah, one of my coworkers, Keely, is currently working on trailer bill language. You have to work very closely with the budget staff, probably the budget subcommittee staff of your issue area. They are working on trailer bill language, so you would work with them and give them what your proposal is and see if it can be included in the official trailer bill language that the legislature passes. So that would be my number one thing. Just work very closely with those budget committee consultants. Okay, now to start on the budget process timeline. So the governor introduces his state budget proposal by January 10th of each year. This budget is predicated on November fiscal forecasts of how the economy is going. And so those fiscal forecasts give you an idea of how much money the state is going to take in. What is our sales tax revenue? What is our corporate tax revenue? What is our personal income tax revenue? So it's going on assumptions of what that is going to be. It's also looking at what we think the caseload is going to be in certain programs like CalWORKS or CalFresh, or what is our prison population going to be. So all of those forecasts go into the January budget bill. Because they're projections, they are often wrong. So you will see, if you're noticing, you're following the budget process, that the governor says, hey, we have a $5 billion deficit, and then that grows later on in the year. And that's because it is a forecast and things become clearer later on in the process, how much money the state actually has and what our population or the demands of our programs. The Department of Finance, which is controlled over under the governor, puts out their own forecast, and the Legislative Analyst's Office, which advises the legislature, also puts out what their forecasts are of the deficit and our money situation. They're often different, but they're both interpreting the data probably in different ways. So, and there could be some political reasons for having a certain kind of forecast, but they are based on numbers, but that you can have very different interpretations of how that is going to play out. So when the governor introduces his state budget proposal, it goes into two bills, which I mentioned, an AB bill to go through the Assembly, an SB bill to go through the Senate. But then it goes to the budget committee of each house, which is broken down into individual subcommittees. Those subcommittees cover different things like health and human services, like corrections, like general government, transportation, housing, etc. And they start deliberating on the budget. Once the budget goes into two different houses, you'll see the budget bills diverge, but I'll get back to that in a second. But these budget subcommittee hearings, which start in late February, are really the best time for your average advocate to influence the process because they have public hearings. People could go to those hearings and you could give testimony. Unfortunately, they don't give you a lot of time. It's rare you get 2 minutes. You usually get a minute. Sometimes it even goes to 30 seconds. But they will listen to what you're advocating for, such as, we think we need more childcare slots than the governor had in his budget. And then talking about their experience as a childcare provider, for example. So those budget committee hearings are happening February through May, but then on May 14th, the governor releases the May revision of the budget. The May revision of the budget is it has the advantage of having April tax receipts in. And so we have a much better idea of the fiscal situation of the states. So at that time, um, the forecast or the budget proposal changes. If there's a bigger deficit, the governor might propose more cuts. If there's a surplus, which believe it or not happens sometimes, we have he could provide new programs. So once that revision is out, the subcommittees meet again and they start closing out their items. Usually in February before the May revise, they are just discussing items. They don't make a lot of decisions. After the May revise, they make their decisions. And this is when the budget can become a very different document in the Senate and the Assembly. So right now, the Senate and the Assembly have both put out their budget proposals. The Senate is much more generous to our programs than the Assembly, but if I have time, I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So then June 15th, which we're rapidly coming up upon, the legislature must pass the budget bill. So in 2010, the voters passed Proposition 25, which gave this deadline for the legislature. The deadline, if they don't pass a budget by that time, legislators must forfeit their per diem and salary for each day the budget is late, and they can't get it back. So since Prop 25 was passed, they have never been late. And for folks who've been around for a long time, like me, the budget used to drag out until July, August, even September one year. So that doesn't really happen. So right now, we're on Thursday, we're hearing that the Assembly and the Senate have agreed on one budget proposal. The language is being developed for the budget bill and some of the trailer bills, and the legislature will vote on it on Monday. The bill should be in print tomorrow, but there's a 72-hour rule before the legislature can discuss the budget, so they will debate it on Monday. What's important is I think ever since we've had this June 15th deadline, a lot of times the budget that is passed on June 15th isn't the real final budget. It's really only the agreement between the Assembly and the Senate. And in late June, they will continue to have negotiations between the governor and the Senate leader and the Assembly leader. So those are called the big three. So that's the Assembly Speaker, the Senate President pro tem, and the governor. Back in the day, it used to be the big five because it included the leadership of each house, the Republican leader. But now that we have a supermajority, they're kind of shut out of those last negotiations, and it's really just the big three. June 30th is the deadline for the governor to sign the budget. And then the start of the new fiscal year is July 1st. And then July through December, they start it all over again and they start developing the budget for next year. Next slide. So developing your budget proposal, what is the need, what is your solution, and what is the cost? So since you're going to get this presentation afterwards, I encourage you, if you want to get involved in the budget process, to go back to slide 11, which was Whitney's slide on developing your legislative proposal, because it's really a lot of the same analysis as you have in the legislative process, identifying the problem, the issue at hand, who is harmed or impacted by your issue. What is the solution? How does your proposal solve that? What are the relevant state agencies? Department of Healthcare Services, if this is a health proposal, Department of Social Services for CalWorks or CalFresh. Cost, how much would the proposal cost the state? You could work with the legislative analyst's office, state agencies, the Department of Finance to try to get a cost. and potential funding sources, which I think Whitney mentioned on the bill front. Um, Although it's not necessarily the advocate's job to say, how are you going to pay for this? But this year, when we're looking at a lot of harmful cuts from HR1, we are very much advocating for progressive revenues to be included in this state's budget proposal. There are a variety of revenue solutions that are on the bench that we hope get off the bench. But we're definitely, and not just the Western Center, I think all of the progressive organizations we're working with are open to revenue solutions that are progressive revenue solutions. So, it's all that we can get. So that is something that we're very much doing right now. So I wanted to talk about when to advocate. So that chart I showed a couple slides back ended with the signing of the budget on July 1st. But what's important to know is that on July 1st or soon after that, they're really starting to develop the next year's budget. So it's always happening. The Department of Finance is very busy here, and what state departments and agencies are doing is that they're getting together budget change proposals. And those proposals can be predicated on legislation that was passed, new positions that might be required to implement it, new technology that might need to be, uh, instituted in order for something to happen. Just a lot of different things that needs to be in the governor's budget in January. And then a lot of times the governor has their own ideas and their own proposals, which I think Governor Newsom has done that quite a bit while he has been in office. So this is a really important time in the fall. But I do want to mention that the fall is much more of an insider's process. The Western Center does get involved in the fall. Your average advocate that doesn't have all the time to spend on this is involved later in the process, mainly the subcommittee process. But during this time in the fall, they are developing that budget that's released on January 10th. And if I didn't say it before, our fiscal year, it was implied, is July 1st through June 30th of the next year. In September through October, we send budget letters to legislative leadership, the governor's office, relevant state agencies and departments with proposals that we're backing and things that we are supportive for in the budget. So, for example, I work with the Californians for SSI Coalition. We fight every year to get an increase to the grants, to get the automatic cost of living increase reinstituted. So we send our budget letter to legislative leaders in the hopes that it's going to be included in the January 10th budget proposal that the governor releases. Definitely doesn't always happen. So after that, the governor's January budget proposal, advocates look at it. They look at the budget summary, look at budget documents. But then they need to find a champion for their proposal. So that would be a senator or an assembly member. And the Senate and Assembly have done things differently recently, and that the Assembly requires you to have an Assembly member that is the author for your proposal. The Senate doesn't always require that. They could add your item to the agenda, although it might not be discussed. But I must say, they change their process a lot of times. So it's hard to say what it's going to be year to year. But this is when people are finding that champion, meeting with key budget staff and legislative leadership, sending the post may revise letter to say, or the post-release letter to say what was in the governor's budget that you supported, because sometimes it's things that you support, but also things that were left out. So at this point, you're really trying to get what you want in the budget to be in the budget. So then when the subcommittees are meeting, starting in February, like I said, that's the best time for public comment on the budget and to try to push your priorities publicly. Next slide. And then after the May revise to late May, that's when the budget committees I mentioned, they start making their decisions. They close out. They'll have additional hearings after May 14th with public comment, your last chance there. Send post-May revise budget letter to, talk still about what you like and what you don't like. And then you just attend those last hearings. So now we are in the June process. I have a question mark over conference committee because they used to have a public conference committee where they would look at the Senate version of the budget, the Assembly version of the budget. They would either take what the Senate said or the Assembly said, or they would make a compromise. It was a public hearing. It didn't have testimony, but it was a public hearing. But that has gone by the wayside. We kind of thought maybe it would come back this year, but no, it did not. So negotiations really went behind closed doors. And that's when the Assembly and the Senate released their version of the budget, but advocates are still out there advocating for our issues, whether it is meetings with legislative leaders, with budget staff, with budget committee members, social media, different kinds of posts to get your priority pushed, even though those negotiations are behind closed doors. And so, like I said here, there are media events, press conferences, grassroots events. The picture that you see was at the recent California End Child Poverty Advocacy Day, which we were a part of, pushing for our priorities, especially in the food space, because HR 1 did terrible things to SNAP, CalFresh in California, and also to Medi-Cal, Medicaid at the federal level. So we are working on those issues now. Next slide. Who has the power in the budget process? Important to know. The governor really has three bites at the apple because he introduces the budget, he leads negotiations in the big three, and he signs the budget, including line item veto authority, where he could cut out a budget item, he could reduce the cost. He can't add anything in the margins, though. I have found that Newsom has not made large use of the line item veto. Pretty much by the time the budget gets to his desk, he has had so much input that he is not doing a lot of line item vetoes. I think I saw more line item vetoes under Republican governors. And then the legislative leaders, you see their pictures there, the Speaker of the Assembly, Robert Rivas, the Speaker pro tem of the Senate, Monique Limon. Both of these leaders are a little more moderate than some of the leadership we've had in the past, so that's an important thing to know. The budget chairs, Senator Laird and Assemblymember Gabriel, and the subcommittee chairs. What's great to know about at least the issues that I work on and a lot of the Western Center issues on human services is that our subcommittee chairs are fantastic. We have Senator Menjivar from the San Fernando Valley. She chairs Senate Sub 3 on Health and Human Services. She takes the social worker lens to the issues as a social worker, and she really understands the issues. Same thing on the Assembly. In the Human Services, it is Corey Jackson, who was a really strong advocate for our programs. But they're not the only people that are part of the process. There are other people to negotiate with. Next slide. So sometimes people are involved in the legislative process, passing a bill like Whitney talked about. Sometimes people are involved in the budget process for the program, and sometimes both. If you have an expensive proposal, especially one that is over that $150,000 threshold that was in the appropriations limit, you probably have to look at the budget process and try to get your program funded in the budget. Sometimes people just work through the budget process by getting an item in the bill and also working on trailer bill language to get their item, the narrative and the policy they need for their item to happen. Sometimes they have a bill in the legislative process also to help them develop those policy ideas. The legislative process is very helpful for having the legislature really debate your proposal to refine your language, and then language can be dropped into a trailer bill at the end of the budget process. I think I have to hurry up, but right now we are working on AB 2299, which is a bill to try to get back some of those benefits that are being cut to the SNAP program, CalFresh in California. So we have a bill and a budget going on. Next slide. I'm going to let Whitney go.
Okay, so just to cover a couple persuasive like advocacy tips. One, meetings with members. You'll want to do this throughout the process, especially for your bills or when you're covering budget priorities. And this could be through your lobby days or just trying to coordinate meetings with members um, before like a big hearing when your bill is going to be up or what before the budget is going to be voted on. So one is just getting a group together and knowing your bill, who supports it, the opposition, and trying to make your case. It really, when you're meeting with members, helps to share your personal stories to really drive home why this is important. Um, Always be polite, even if you're meeting with like a Republican member or a member who maybe you don't see eye to eye with. At the end of the day, just like we all try to keep it professional and treat everyone with respect. If you don't know the answer to a question, it's okay to say, I'm not sure, but I'll get back to you. But make sure you follow up. That's really key to like building trust and building those relationships. And then at the end of your meeting, after you've gone through your priority agenda items, it can sometimes help to ask like, oh, will you commit to supporting our proposal or supporting our bill or supporting raising revenues? Um, and then most of the time, be prepared for a short meeting. Usually, the meetings with members or their staff can be anywhere from like 15 to 20 or even 30 minutes if you're lucky. But then on the short end, someone might come out and say, like, oh, I'm between meetings. I only have 5 minutes. So you might need to also have like an elevator pitch prepared. And then just be sure you can grab their business cards afterwards and follow up with a thank you and any materials um, afterwards. And then this is what we call the one pager, like your fact sheet. This is kind of the basis of everything that you do. All of the research and analysis that you do for your bill kind of gets distilled into this one page fact sheet. And you'll use this when you meet with members or to share it with partners and other stakeholders, or yeah, just with the public writ large. You want to keep it to one page front and back maximum, because a lot of people are going to just be skimming through this and want the high level points. Um, this is really another strategy is like this is really where you get to frame the issue and set the tone and the narrative. So just be mindful and conscious of that. And also think about your audience. Legislators and their staff, the public, or even other advocates have varying levels of familiarity with these issues. And so I try to make it as accessible as possible and not use jargon or acronyms to be mindful of that. And then also, we all work with coalitions very often. Just kind of with the adage, like if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. Um, Everyone in the coalition brings different strengths. And so really lean on like each other's strengths and building trust with your partners is key. Maybe your co-sponsor group for the bill might be like your smaller coalition. And then the broader coalition might be like community groups and other supporting organizations where you can lean on to gather stories and data. on your issue, or to mobilize community members to show up to hearings and lobby days, or to just help provide extra lobbying support, maybe if you're facing like very tough opposition and you really need to be walking the halls or making a lot of phone calls to really get your bill through. And then we'll send these slides out so you'll have these links, but just wanted to highlight a few useful links in your advocacy where you can go and find more information. And that is, we're at time, we're a little over time. Thank you so much for attending, everyone. And I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes if there's any questions. Also, please, a reminder, fill out the survey. I think Rashida put it in the chat several times, but to receive MCLE credit. Thanks, everyone.
Also happy to stay on.